Okay. Welcome everyone. This is Wednesday office hours for the 17th of June. And this is part of the larger project I've been fiddling around with. And as I think you've noticed, I've gone probably far afield, but it's not so far in the sense that the point of this or the research question is quantification does occur in political economy, of course. Marxian political economy, of course, is a different take on it. Uh, and the approach to it has taken a variety of forms. Uh, Singh does it a certain way with national data. Um, Kakshut does a similar thing, but not with the same data, with the different data. Um, and these are large big data projects of one kind or another, and they have various implications for the original sorts of ideas to show, for example, that um, uh, income diverges, or wages diverge from wealth, or there's increasing poverty and disparity, and et cetera. So the kind of 19th century observations that Marx had are not, you know, uh, not wrong in that sense. The problem, of course, is that various folks who not necessarily would call themselves Marxists, but who would be post-Keynesians or whatever, and who look at much more quote unquote scientific ways of considering certain types of problems relative to a macroeconomy have taken it in certain directions. Ones that resemble something called econophysics, which itself is kind of limited in its own from a neoclassical perspective. So there is this sort of automatic tendency to identify neoclassical economics with econophysics and with standard models of the same models of mechanics that physics looks at, mainly because that's the model that they've been building from to look at cycles of events, certain things that that have velocity, for example. So there's all those things that are there that are not controversial, not problematic from a physics point of view. But we also know that physics itself moved in a variety of directions. Newtonian mechanics was augmented or amplified by Einsteinian physics, relativity, etc. And that's not problematic, although, people have get into arguments about, whether Einstein was correct about the orbit of Mercury or something, whatever. That's not for our interest, but we note that, of course, the mathematics is, on the one hand, not very different, but also has moved in another direction, partially because of the ability to handle in a computational way some of the mathematical ideas. So that's why, and not very many people have moved a point of view about political economy in that direction, but I think they should, and that they shouldn't surrender the field to neoclassical financial or financialization modeling, because that's as dominant as those ideas are with so-called quantum economics. They're not the only way to look at this. And we've had a century and a half to sort of say, well, certain things don't quite, measure up in reality. It's certain equilibrium concepts are problematic or unrealistic in some ways, and it's clear, as we've been fiddling around with this idea of an analytic Marxism, that there's a whole period where people buy into certain methodological issues, whether it's methodological individualism, an idea that is certainly not Marxist, and in fact is the kind of thing indulged in by Hayek and Mies, so that there's a whole libertarian thing there, and we can go off and get lost on how that is or isn't a kind of subjectivity. So anyway, that's for another day. I think what we should do is see where certain fundamental principles operate, and to do it in a relatively intelligible and simple way, or hopefully both. So the point here today, we're going to look at a variety of things. We're going to look at an article on ground rent, and not because it's ground rent itself is important, but that this particular article updates the literature. It's a kind of literature review, if you want to consider the front end of the article, but it has its own agendas. It's the FTC Manning's article. It's a good article. At the front end, very encyclopedic, and in the back end, she, and I think FTC Manning is she, wants to include, for the usual reasons, the intersectional implications of talking about ground rent, because as she observes in a very clear way, and not dealt with by a significant number of people who talk about rent in the modern period, and that is, I mean, she talks about the whole, in developing countries, how ground rent is under evaluated or under assessed, and is usually not thought of at kind of the front end of the problem, because it when you start talking about rent or rent ideas, particularly in the developing country context, it runs afoul of all the usual kinds of things that you are legitimating a pre-existing quasi-feudal structure. You're reinforcing all kinds of other issues that are empirically problematic, but she tries to tackle them, and I think that's a good thing for the article. But that's not our focus today. As important as those issues are, if from a critique of capitalism, etc., that element of it is not the focus of where I want to take this. And so, as I said, we back up a bit, talk a little bit about the front end, that you could have a quantum models. They can assess things like capital, environment, and the way that rent fits into this is because it is obviously something highly intangible, yet is, as from a materialist point of view, it still manifests itself, right? I mean, it does, for all the usual reasons. And so, ultimately, it's not that it's trivial or epiphenomenal or whatever. It isn't any of those things. And my comments before on including various, like that NBER paper on tangible and intangible forms of capital, and a whole variety of the taxonomy of the different ways to approach that. It's not simply the idea of tangible, intangible, which is not a false dichotomy. Simply, it is, it's a binary model in that sense. It's not necessarily dichotomous, but it only gives us one part of the picture. But I used that a couple of weeks ago to sort of indicate that when we start talking about capital at this fairly less material sort of position, you want to be able to talk about it in fairly accurate ways. And I think that's really important, because unfortunately, or fortunately, that the notion of capital, of course, has gotten not short shrift. It has a problematic history relative to capital seen in the neoclassical context and capital seen in the whatever it is, the heterodox context. Point being is that it is measurable. It has other issues that are part of the capital process, or its defining process, and that is, of course, when you get down to the sort of uh, functional, and I'm not using that in the way that it's functionalist, it's just that certain functional elements, like talking about value and price. Um, there's an entire literature there that has its own kind of issues, and I'm not trying to trash those particular things. For example, value form Marxism, etc. That discourse is not very difficult. I think it's interesting. It's important. It's part of a larger discussion one needs to have. But the point I'm trying to make is that we shouldn't sort of resolve things into ways that support a somewhat anachronistic way of approaching the problem. So the second article we'll look at today is Piyamit uh, Leelatham's or article that is a critique of Yanis Varoufakis' idea about techno-feudalism, or at least the conclusion that the Marxian law of value no longer applies. Well, I think that, we don't need to spend time saying whether it is or it isn't or it's non-applicable. It is heuristic in the sense that you need to sort of cope with it in certain ways. And it's it it is you're not negating its value by having this kind of discussion, and it's important to see it that way. What Leelatham um, is trying to get at is the idea that, well, I'm over projecting on that, but I would assert that Leelatham's critique of Varoufakis is on the issue of probably oversimplifying the problem, or using the analogy of feudalism, as in primitive communism, feudalism, or slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism, that kind of history, as it were, material history, and it being used as a useful conceit, I would assert, in Varoufakis' work to talk about, techno-fascism as a function of techno-feudalism. And, he makes various arguments, and the article will, we'll read through that. Point being is that I would assert that Varoufakis is doing it for, as it were, metaphorical reasons or literary reasons, much like Varoufakis' earlier book on the Minotaur. We're not, talking about minotaurs themselves, but rather, what that sort of represents. And I think that his notion of techno-feudalism, techno-fascism, has that same sort of literary element. And of course, that's a self-critique of someone who wants to move the discourse into areas that would take advantage of quantum math, which emphasizes certain ideas, superimposition, entanglement, that while that seems, sort of highfalutin, it is a way in which we can talk about certain ideas a little better. That is the discussion of capital from the 19th century doesn't lose that much, and it doesn't really lose that much, particularly because of this notion of rent, because that is actually expanded and is part of the front end issue about talking about techno whatever. Rent helps us work through some of those problems. Now, rent is not the answer. Rent is simply a means by which we can talk about the larger set of issues and actually find certain certain ways in which you can talk about sort of operationalize the problem to sort of put it together as a research problem. So I raised similar research kind of questions before. Where we are now is to come to back some basic general points again. Could a socialist economy both need human needs and restore ecological balance? Because pretty clear that some people don't care about the ecological balance and don't even care about human needs in the sense that that they only serve their own class. People have own class interests as opposed to human interests, and that's well, we can go off on that. But the point is, or the underlying question for some authors, particularly those writing in eco-socialism, is to ask whether a socialist economy can do both of those things. Because on the one hand, in a dichotomous way, you could say that it's it either over focuses on human needs, and doesn't care about nature, or the reverse, where the humans are situated in nature, and where you take the individualism from a slightly different perspective. But anyway, so today the articles that we'll look at two different things. And the reason why we looked at semiotics before is to provide an additional means by which we can talk about certain types of capital, that is digital capital, and to understand that it is capital, or that it is capitalized, that it's a very clear problem in the current state. Not that we're going to solve all of those problems like crypto, etc., but they are part of the problem, and we do need to refine or revise or modify our context of rent in that particular context. So the business model of the internet socio-digital platforms, SDPs, is probably the key to all of our problems, perhaps. Alphabet, Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc. And there's a whole literature, and there's you've got a lot of ways in which you can talk about it. So rent allows us to think of some part of that, and it has been sort of modified or polluted or obscured by the neoclassical discourse, which would talk about "quote unquote" a rent-seeking society, etc. And you can use it. You're euphemizing greed in that sense, but and that doesn't get us anywhere. It's just a different way of dressing up, sort of maximizing utility. And that doesn't really get us anywhere. I mean, it's okay to do it, and it works out mathematically, etc. But it doesn't really account for the differences, as Marx identifies them, between production and distribution, or production and consumption. Conversely, or obversely, discussions of the commodity, Marx's concept of commodity, sort of writ large, is also problematized when you move off into the other area of consumption that refers to, for example, commodity fetishism, and that's fine. It has an entire thing you can deal with, but once you begin to think about it in certain ways to try and get a handle on both elements, Department 1 and Department 2, you want to sort of get beyond that set of discussions. The current discussion of communication and information, and from a Marxian point of view, tends to look at certain features or elements that are very interesting and important. The semiotics is one way of getting at the problem, but it's kind of not very useful in certain ways. In other ways, it become useful, as I've mentioned before, if you only think about certain types of in semiotics, certain types of signs, or sign functions, however you want to talk about it, sign effects. And that's why I bring up the concept of indexicality, because in fact, I think that that's where, and with all due respect to Charles Sanders Peirce and a bunch of other folks, that's kind of where the action is in terms of using a quantum model, because things happen, at a spooky distance or whatever. They the indexicality is a way in which we can talk about things that are either more indirect, uh, or less direct, however you want to think about it. The question of contact or effect or instrumentality or whatever you want to talk about these are important states and ideas that are not discussed adequately within a heterodox literature. Now, I know that some people do it and blah, blah, blah. That's why there's a modern monetary theory, because it actually is addressing some of these issues, albeit from an area that is sort of self-limiting, i.e. money. But because well, that's a whole nother story, but the money gets us into a whole different set of issues that, on the one hand, is really important it serves as a kind of part of our larger argument, because you do need, in order to assess, rent ideas, you do need some money thing, some monetary thing. And that's all important, but it's not the defining characteristic. It's just simply one way of sort of measuring some of it, but it's not the way or the absolute way. And so, in order to get at this problem, we have to sort of think not not without a certain amount of energy, is the idea that we can use certain 19th century concepts to sort of work through some of these problems, not reducing or over-determining certain elements of it. In other words, if you're going to talk about rent, sure, you're going to look at a Ricardian model on which, Marx builds off of that relative to rent, and then, things after the volume 1 of Capital, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is, to start at the front end, Marx wrote about things in an incomplete way. So we're trying to fill in all of these other little things. And the absence of that material shouldn't bother us at all. For some people, it does bother. They get bothered because if he didn't mention it, then it's not useful. Well, that's not true. I mean, it's just not true. It's an incomplete project. We know because of Engels and Lenin and et cetera that, that's not the issue. Now, the problem, of course, is when you move in certain directions, like Lenin does, et cetera, you get all off into some other crazy stuff that, while interesting and academically important and part of the, building of the entire, knowledge, the canon, it doesn't help us with certain other key ideas that are at the front end of political crises, revolutionary subjectivity, all that stuff isn't given enough tools to work with in that sense. So we're talking mainly in an academic and analytic way here, and it's not very traditional in that sense. But and for some people, it's problematic because you're not talking about class struggle and blah blah blah. And we went through a whole set of arguments about that. That you're not a class enemy if you indulge in this kind of stuff, because ultimately it allows you to better identify those things that make people class enemies, etc., which is part of the financialization argument that never gets fully, sort of explicated, partially because, we're working within capitalism. You're surrounded by people who just simply are motivated by greed or money or wealth or whatever, and it that always sort of obfuscates getting at the argument, and often it reduces our ability to talk about those things. So we're trying to get past that and get to a place that, while seemingly not as palpable, because we're looking at a different way of thinking about, for example, observation. Um, we need to sort of think more expansively, think as if quantum states were useful, and we'll get there. So I've spent a lot of time, as I usually do, yammering at the front end about kind of the way the argument goes, and I've rehearsed, of course, some of the key elements, and I haven't changed what I've been thinking about or whatever. I just, keep on, sort of having to rehearse a little bit in each of these little sessions. So, if economic agents and markets exist in states of probability rather than fixed certainty until an quote unquote observation, that is a transaction, occurs, does such a concept resemble the difference between use value and exchange value? Now, our point in this argument here is to look at the resemblance of the difference, which perhaps takes it one step above that. But it also is a way in which we can talk about what I was just mentioning, the indexicality of transactions, that is that nothing is certain or everything is uncertain or indeterminate in that sense. And hence, states of probability are actually quite normal on the one hand. On the other hand, uh, stuff needs to happen, and the way in which we get to things or do things needs to have some sort of adjustment in that particular way. So that's and that may not be very satisfying at this moment, but I hopefully you'll see that this is useful. So anyway, so I've introduced some of the basic ideas. Let's step aside or sideways for a moment and we talk about why semiotics fits into that. And as I mentioned before, there's a useful little article that talks about the semiotics of commodity in the context of Marx. So the Marxian concept of value is a cultural and hence a semiotic concept, which is true, rather than economic. And so I put the little SIC there to indicate that, with all due respect and not to sound like a tanky or anything, it's all economic. It's always economic. And we shouldn't worry about that. The point of this whole thing about the semiotics of economics, et cetera, that we were looking at before, is to show that not only do we consume signs in the commodity fetishism, et cetera, that in each act of such a consumption, as it were, or the distribution of certain types of ideas or signs, we find that the act of consuming is also an act of production. I know that's probably oversimplifying it, and it actually goes back to some very fundamental ideas, not Marxian necessarily, but that are in sort of the golden age of people trying to figure out the political economy of science. So anyway, based on a scrutiny of Marx's writings, this article proposes, this is that commodity article, that Marx's analysis of the commodity can and should also be interpreted as a semiotic treatise. This insight may also be relevant to contemporary Marxist investigations concerning labor and value in capitalism, insofar as the notion of value of commodities is concerned. Now, whereas the literature on the crisis of value theories, has focused primarily on the relationship between use value and exchange value, and of course, abstract labor, which is what we've been talking about for weeks. The present paper, that is this little paper here, focuses on the aspect of the sign value of commodities in Marxist theory and on how the notion of value represents human labor. So that may seem as though tautological in one sense, relative to the talks about human labor. But if you've been following along, we're not, we've looked at the differences between labor power, action, energy. There's a whole way in which you can think about these things that doesn't have to be burdened by certain ideas that are obviously necessary and in real life that no, class struggle does exist. It's just that you don't always have to sort of front end all your arguments about class struggle and sort of, constantly declare your class affiliations or affinities or whatever, and not worry so much about that, because it's pretty clear, I hope, that it proletarianism is it's a standard state, and much of the problems of the last couple of centuries are bourgeois problems or petty bourgeois problems. Um, all of which need to be, sort of resolved in some kind of a way, class struggle wise. But anyway, that's getting too far afield. So the use value may be then understood as the form of content of the semiotic relation, that is, cultural unities that describe, represent, and are linked to consumption needs and behaviors of capitalist society. That all seems hopefully obvious. The point I want to make underlying that is consumption slash distribution, department 2, is also in and of itself a productive relation, because that's what you do when you consume. Is you're performing an action. It is productive in a variety of ways, and and you need to account for that in ways that are signify that one is not quite as a passive. Now, I'm not asserting that's oversimplifying it also, but that in the act of consumption, it is also an act of production, um, and which is a slightly different way of looking at some of the ways in which, for example, Richard Wolff, etc., talk about some of those sort of problematic issues that have to do with um, ideology, etc. But we'll get back to that. So I included the diagram from that article talking about semiotic labor and social digital products. And the point is that a way in which we can talk about this in terms of talking about algorithms, etc., is to talk about these as a kind of semiotic labor. Now, that just even considering the notion of a semiotic labor has all kinds of other implications, and let's not try and go there right now. But I would assert that, and this is where, if you can believe that signs are part of this process, whether it's defining tangible versus intangible capital that is used on the production side, and the similar argument for capital on the consumption department 2 side. The point, of course, is that these are all mediated by a variety of signs. That is, that our understanding of fixed capital resources or constant capital are, have semiotic elements in it. You don't have to sort of do a lot of arm waving or, mystifying or labeling. You don't have to worry about the taxonomy of it. I think you have to sort of get a sense that that's kind of what's going on. That is, a fixed capital or constant capital resource has these kinds of elements built into it that aren't necessarily, but often are, available in the more localized production process. If you're in a factory, you need machines. The machines are built by other people somewhere else, and there's an entire, society or culture built into the construction of the machines, of the technology, the tools that you're using. So there's a whole other set of things going on, and this shouldn't be controversial or problematic. There's plenty of literature on this, so one shouldn't worry so much about it. It's just to be able to call it and not call it a kind of semiotic element, and not necessarily get too bogged down in the kind of material elements of it, because there are material elements. I mean, that's just, stuff's made out of stuff. It's just that it's a much more complicated process, and the description of that, of course, Marx doesn't get fully worked out, although he does, and this is to critique some of this other literature. The ground rent article, for example, ground rent, the ground rent article sort of suffers from thinking always that ground rent is literally ground rent. I mean, that is rent relative to uh, surface territory, whereas I think where Marx was going, and he didn't fully work this through, like in volume one, etc. Uh, but it's much more, sort of multi-layered. It's more geologic in that sense. When Marx talks about mining, for example, um, he's implying that there's more than just sort of digging gold out of the ground and, sort of expending labor to mine stuff, etc. He's also talking about the whole context of it, how we think of nature, how we think in a kind of a layered sort of way. But anyway, that's for another bit of yakking. So the article that this is from, for talking about SDPs, is the semiotics of the commodity and the Marxian concept of value. This is a Marcos Dantas article. And as I said, I think it's a useful article. It may not be perfect. In fact, it has a lot of imperfection, but I think because it utilizes certain semiotic elements, not all semiotic elements, just takes a particular one among many different semiotic approaches. And yes, there are many semiotic approaches. People often assume that then there's some sort of monolithic, sign theory thing going on. And that's just not true. I mean, you look at the literature and it's 100 different ideas or theories, and they do kind of fit together, or you just have to sort of work through what those issues are. So this is a Peircean kind of way of looking at exchange value, use value, and value, situating the commodity in terms of value in the consumer culture, and this little thing down here about cultural unities is sort of part of the way in which you sort of glue all this stuff together. And the point is that this is, not, you don't just go plug everything in the world into this notion, or into the, it is just simply as an example to get us to think about the difference between use value and exchange value, or use value and value, which is already confused relative to volume one of Capital, but to sort of step past that. Now, one way in which you could think about this, and this is a different way of talking about this, and let me just read through the front end here, but it doesn't fully answer the question. It does get to the idea of a semiotic material labor. That is, and this goes back to the other thing about trying to estimate what labor might be in terms of, sort of energy potentials or whatever. And so Dantas here quotes not only from the standard, front end structuralist literature, De Boer, etc., spectacles and blah, blah, blah. But, this one little quote from Marx is actually good. The more the metamorphoses of circulation of a certain capital are only ideal, i.e., the more the time of circulation is equal to zero or approaches zero, already that's interesting, the more does capital function, the more does its productivity and the self-expansion of its value increase. So Marx here is talking, about something intangible and also obviously quantifiable relative to, sort of numbers. And so there's something else going on here. And, I think it's left to us to sort of, figure that out. Hence what we're doing now. However, in an apparent paradox, if political economy intended to place the use value on the edge of its investigations, it would now need to retrace its route and attempt to understand it in the context of fetishist consumption as central to explaining the accumulation of rentier capital, essential to the explaining the accumulation of rentier capital. Accumulation, however, still based on labor as substance of value in semiotic material labor. So that seems, maybe too tautological or whatever. The point being, of course, that all of these elements are part of a larger system of signs, and it's not our job to sort of measure the signs. That's not the point. I mean, some people would trash the argument by saying, well, it's hard to measure it. And it's true that it's hard to measure it, but the issue is not so much about that as it is working through the kind of problem to assume that um, not to obsess about the issue of trying to build, whole sign system thing, a useful model, blah, blah, blah. What you want to do is move to a point at which it becomes possible to talk about things in a slightly inverted way. This is the point of going to, this is why quantum stuff works, because you can put materially, quantum things are material. You just have to rethink what counts as material. Because that's kind of what, even in this quote here, is what Marx is sort of implying, not that we're overreading into it, but it's really important to consider that. Anyway, all righty then. Now, from the quantum literature, now there's a whole quantum thing I'm working on, and there's a really interesting point of view that's presented by a guy in the PRC who talks about, he's talking about quantum mechanics, but he's talking about it in a way where he's trying to account for something that's very key to the front end of the problem. That is the issue of whether things are ontic or epistemic. And I know that's that's just over dichotomizing the problem. And he spends a lot of time trying to work through that. And he actually, gets in fights with people about, oh, what is it that you're arguing and blah, blah, blah. And it's a pretty dense literature on the one hand, and it's being waged at a, pretty, sort of meta theoretical level, but it is still something that affects us. Remember, we were talking about Maxwell's demon, etc., and it without overindulging the idea that scientists using metaphors can become kind of not very useful. I mean, it's interesting, but it actually kind of creates more problems than it solves. So the reality and the point that Sean Gao is trying to work through is the difference that has been already worked out. There's plenty of stuff that tries to work this out, but he's trying to frame it in a way that fits the things together and makes it more intelligible. That is, the particle and wave models, for light, for example, or and while the critique, of course, of applying quantum ideas is that people are not atoms, for example, that's not the point. The point is the activity or actions that are built around this, and that the logic of the argument is going to be important for us for our little semiotic problem. So this is from Gao's work. The reality of the wave function has been a hot topic of debate since the early days of quantum mechanics. Is the wave function real, directly representing the ontic state of a physical system, or is it epistemic, that is, merely representing a state of incomplete knowledge about the underlying ontic state? Now, just in that sense alone is the question raised by Marx about the general intellect in volume 1, I guess. I guess it gets mentioned in volume 2, but this is not that different. It truly is not that different, and there's not enough literature done, or not enough. Well, there is literature, but we haven't really worked through what Marx meant by that. But it's pretty clear that it overlaps with a lot of this Marxian political economic communication information literature. So what I'm suggesting is another way of looking at the problem without getting too tied down with certain either neoclassical notions of measurement or things that are not quite so useful. So if you think about this little quantum state problem, and there's some interesting diagrams related to that, here's one. Uh, one possibility of a psi epistemic wave function, two agents assign two different wave functions to the same system. That seems without, it already is problematic for some people to, account. This is it gets back to the demon problem partially, or, Schrodinger, et cetera. But the math that's where the math comes from. I mean, that's the underlying math of it is to work through things that are not seen. I mean, this goes to Schrodinger's issue. So that may seem all purely metaphorical. There's a dead cat in the box, whatever. You can make jokes about it, but the fundamental issue still is there about what is or isn't observable and what is or isn't, by extension, a material in that context. Now, all this seems like analytical fiddling around, and it doesn't seem very, satisfying in a phenomenological way, but I would assert that it is. It actually goes to the fundamental issues, the front end of actually phenomenological discourse. But anyway, so I put a little thing in here. It's it's just a thing because it's a chapter on rent in a book that not many people look at. It's been around. It just people don't look at it and don't talk about it too much. And this is Kieran McCone's Marxist Political Economy and Marxist Urban Sociology. And part of what he's trying to figure out here is the question of how rent, and this is a wider literature. Max Edel, a bunch of Ball, a bunch of other folks have been, got really interested in this because it's not simply the literal idea of an urban rent, but that the idea that once you get people into cities, the rent problem, the idea of rent becomes much more complicated. And while, solvable, and it has measures, it has things you can talk about, and of course, the application and this sort of underlying subliterature that talks about how rent occurs in differential 1 and 2 and in absolute ways. That's all fine. Because it focuses on the difference between new ways of thinking about the fertility problem, new ways of thinking about sort of technology or objects, and none of that it should be controversial. I mean, but as this the abstract for the article sort of suggests, he sort of suggests that it's not well integrated. And I would assert that, yeah, it's not well integrated, but a whole bunch of other stuff is not well integrated. So it's our job in the 21st century to kind of fix that problem. So Marx devoted a considerable attention to the discussion of land and rent, which suggests that he regarded it as an important element in the analysis of capitalism. However, his theory of rent, and this is overstating the problem, but it's sort of an interesting way in which this problem is framed, because that's kind of the way most people stereotype the problem. However, his theory of rent is based entirely upon the analysis of agricultural production, even though the rest of his theory of capitalism is based on the analysis of industrial production. So, this is oversimplifying the problem. And of course, that Marx just obviously Marx was concerned with industrial production because there's trade unionists, class, workers, et cetera, et cetera. That's all important. It's not unimportant. And the fact that agricultural production is mentioned less, but it's not mentioned less really when you think about the whole sort of wheat and linen and coats and stuff. that's not, it's still agricultural, even though it does become industrial. And you want to sort of work through that problem and not oversimplify it, which is difficult for some people to do. In this sense, Marx's analysis of rent is not integrated tightly into the remainder of his analysis. Well, I mean, you could say that about the whole analysis of rent. You can say that about Marx's analysis. So, you shouldn't. I think that McCown is, it works for his argument in his text, but it doesn't work for the larger question. So, this is not a straw argument, but I would assert that this is the stereotype that many people approach the problem with. This is the emphasis on industrial production. It's not. It's an emphasis. It doesn't exclude agricultural production because it all sort of fits together. And if you read Bellamy, Foster, etc., you know that that's it's not simply excluding nature. That metabolic rifts are complicated things, and they're not. Machines have something to do with it, but they're not the focus of the problem, which is where Bellamy, Foster, and others are, moving it towards the web of life, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are part of the 20th and late 20th and early 21st century kind of notions about how much more fully integrated. Whereas, the argument here is that they're not integrated. They are fully integrated. It makes it much harder to deal with, but you sort of need to accept the complexity of it. That's why we're doing quantum stuff. Now, the second thing here in the many, and we haven't even gotten to the the critique of Varoufakis, so maybe I should buzz through this quickly, if I could. Manning does a really good literature review in the front, or about 50% of her article covers most of the field, though all of the different little problems of, that are collapsed into this idea of thinking about rent as how is it that we can think beyond a political heuristic to expose extractive power relations? It is, of course, but theories of rent are not necessarily about land. I mean, she wants to make it more about land, but it's really not so much about land. I mean, and we know that this is problematic because there's a whole conservative neoclassical literature that says, well, it just rent is another way of talking about stuff that people want to get to build wealth or whatever. Rent-seeking society, blah, 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 which is not very useful or helpful idea, but, it gets people Nobel Prizes. So I've obviously oversimplified that, but the point is that the conclusion or the underlying set of beliefs that Manning has is, for example, Ward and Albers demand that we attend to the unique status of land in the capitalist economy through the special category of rent, while simultaneously insisting that we take rent and extend its reach beyond that of land. That's not contradictory. I mean, it's just one part of the whole problem. And that this explicit contradiction is mimicked more subtly in an array of contemporary literature, and she sort of takes Brett Christophers to task, and he should be taken to task for a variety of other reasons, but no, probably not this one. Or well, maybe not. Anyway, I should write him and ask him. So the list of rentier relationships based on monopoly control notably omits the monopoly of those assets known as the means of production. In fact, perhaps a large portion of the so-called rent extraction is actually capitalist profit. which shouldn't be an issue for Manning, but it seems to be there. And then she does a whole thing where she steps aside to talk about the edamame production in Japan, which is fine in and of itself, but it is a problematic literature because you're talking about a whole bunch of other contingencies relative to the history of the Japanese economy, and its own feudal. We're getting to the techno-feudalism, feudal nature. So anyway, you could read this for yourself. The point is how is that we're going to measure all these things? So interest-bearing assets is one way in which we can talk about it. But then if you talk about interest-bearing assets, then you get into this other tangible, intangible problem that it has other kinds of issues. So which would include the various forms of credit, bonds, and stocks. Here, land is lumped together with other quote unquote pseudo commodities, that is, things that can be sold but are not produced. Now, the Marxist literature gets hung up on this and shouldn't. I mean, in the 21st century, you just can't get hung up on that about unpaid work, for example. They don't account for it very well. And there is, fortunately, a literature that tries to accommodate that. That's partially why semiotics comes in, is to account or sort of nip in the bud the difference between paid and unpaid labor, because that's what hangs up a part of the problems that we see. Well, anyway, that's another story. So let's see, what else did I want to say about that? Anyway, theories of land rent / ground rent can nonetheless offer a way to comprehend patterns that emerge in land-based research. So the defining characteristic, or the limiting characteristic constraint on Manning's discussion here, is that she's very useful for explaining the history of ground rent, or particularly from a left point of view, and gets us to the kind of the threshold of talking about the great financial crisis and how that, and she doesn't argue for it here, but you can see it's kind of at, Michael Hudson actually talks about this a little too, is that, you sort of want to work through this issue of, if it's so not material, and or not class oriented, it is, why, how did it happen the way it happened? But anyway, I've included an article that we might, or a book that we might, I've uploaded a copy to, that is an overall thing that's fairly simple that probably we can go through together. And this is kind of the where the current debates are, where the, this may all seem like sort of peripheral historical fiddling around that I've been doing, but really it all comes back to the same issue. That is, how is it that we can achieve economic democracy, social ownership, something that's more participatory and equitable, et cetera? How is it we're going to get there? How are we going to get to a sustainable economy? And so all of this arm waving about, theoretical matters is a means by which we can critique the thing that is creating anti-democratic things, and, the problem of property, et cetera. All of that needs to have a critique, and to get us back to some basic issues of social ownership, participatory economic democracy, and sustainability in the economy. So, so Simon Hanna is a fairly new book, and he's not widely, sort of distributed relative to, internet stuff. So, I mean, I'm not trashing his ability. He's just not widely known. His focus was on eliminating production for profit and how that can lead to a more sustainable relationship with nature. See, ultimately, this is still getting us back to socialism at some moment. Our first question, is socialism shouldn't scare anybody. And in fact, we should sort of work it through, because that's been the problem of the last century, is, all of the disinformation and noise and et cetera, reactionary crap about communism, socialism, and it's just all ideological crap meant to support those in power, or the ruling class. But anyway, that's another story. He also draws on the Marxist concept of the metabolic rift, the severing of the relationship between human society and nature under capitalism, the relentless drive to create value as something that can be exchanged to generate surplus value has severed the metabolic unity of us with the planet. This crisis, he argues, is not an external malfunction of capitalism. It is capitalism itself. Now, a lot of people who come to this, sort of make this argument, but we need to remind ourselves that is what the issue is. That is it's the mode of production argument, which gets us to the, hopefully, since I've used up a tremendous amount of time, to the Leelatham critique of Varoufakis. So anyway, without rehearsing that, let's get to the core, the core thing we wanted to talk about, which I urge you to sort of think about, because it's a useful article. It identifies a bunch of things that I think are useful in the 21st century and in the current set of issues, and allow us to consider these more, radical solutions or theories that are a little theoretical or even meta-theoretical, but they allow us to get at the argument without getting bogged down in the cloud is feudalist, it's the feudal man. This just doesn't get us anywhere. To think of the cloud as a manor, as manorial, is not very useful. I mean, it's useful for making a rhetorical argument to people who haven't thought of it that way, but it's not very useful for those of us trying to worry about the real feudalism of large-scale data centers or server farms, or however you want to call them, because that's where the real problem is. And yes, at one level, it's a feudal problem, not futile, but feudal, relative to the idea of land and ground rent and all that other stuff. And the analysis has not fully addressed that. I mean, we've talked about water short, that it's, they suck up water, they kill resources, they require actually more energy than you really need to think about. And people argue that they could be self-sustaining with hydrogen, blah blah blah, blah, and wind farms and blah blah blah. That's all crap. At some moment, you have to think about, well, what is regional planning relative to this thing? But anyway, so this is Piyamit, Leelatham's argument against Varoufakis' thesis that under our society of techno-feudalism, Marx's law of value no longer applies. Well, number one, introduction to the persistent logic of capital in the contemporary theater of political economy, a seductive and persuasive narrative has taken hold. The proclamation that we have transitioned into a fundamentally post-capitalist or techno-feudal era. Proponents of this view argue that the ephemeral nature of data, the ubiquitous dominance of global platforms, and the predictive prowess of artificial intelligence have rendered the capitalistic laws of economics obsolete. They point to a world where 96% of the global population accesses the internet via mobile devices, part of a staggering demographic of 6 billion mobile device users, within a global population of 8 billion. As evidence, now this is where it becomes important, and this is why the ontic versus epistemic thing that you would apply to wave and particle theory actually kind of works. But as evidence of an epistemological break from the industrial past, this is a totally misunderstanding or misinterpreting or ignoring uneven development, and that's a whole nother thing that needs to be worked through here, but it's sort of suggested. However, For the Marxist economic theory, these phenomena represent not a departure from capitalism, but its most intensive, refined, and technologically mediated manifestation. So it's not a departure from capitalism, but it is, much more central or centripetal. The digital veil, quote unquote, serves to obscure. Now, this little metaphor is problematic for all kinds of other reasons, but digital veil has the same kind of problem as techno-feudalism. But anyway, serves to obscure the underlying metabolism of capital, yet between the sleek interface of the algorithm, the quote-unquote laws of motion identified by Karl Marx remain the heartbeat of the global system. To demystify the digital economy, one must move beyond the superficiality of innovation, which is what's being fetishized, and utilize the strategic framework of the law of value in the circuit of capital. So this is the key point here, is that, Varoufakis said, well, we've gone past, law of value and blah, blah, blah. Actually, it's maybe we're back at it again from a, long wave point of view. So one should not dismiss it so easily. The current thesis of this analysis is that the digital economy is not a transcendence of the capitalist mode of production, but is its ultimate realization through advanced constant capital. Ultimate realization through advanced constant capital. And this puts us right back into the, the 19th century analysis. The circuit of capital expressed by the formula M-C ... P ... C prime dash M prime remains. This is the fundamental Marxist theorem. Remains the invariant structure of our age. And essentially, this is where we get the issues of Department 1, Department 2, the Ernest Mandel's stuff. It's all sort of there. We never really left it. And to assert that we need to go beyond it really isn't quite useful either. I mean, we do go beyond it because that's what we do. That's why we live. But, it is problematic to, but it sells books. Let's put it that way. Techno-fascism and techno-feudalism sells books. But, you need to get past the need to sell books and sort of work through the ideas. So capital M, that is money, is advanced to purchase commodities, big C, capital C, comprising the means of production, that is data centers and fiber optics, and labor power, plus labor power, to initiate a production process P that yields enhanced commodities C prime, containing surplus value, which must then be realized as increased money. It's all pretty simple from an algebraic point of view, and this is really no different than the 19th century. But you can see just from the application here, data centers, fiber optics, it is. You can see that all there. It is not. You're not sort of shoehorning the idea, and you need to just go to sort of expand the way in which you can think about how is it that surplus value is built, and on what is it built. And this is where the further analysis, which was never fully integrated into the surplus value argument, I mean, it was there, but it got sidetracked by, neo-Ricardianism and a whole bunch of other stupid stuff. The idea that you can talk about rent within the context of surplus value. So anyway, this trajectory from the definition of digital infrastructure to the critique of its most prominent detractors reveals that to understand the quote-unquote new economy, we must first master the law of value that governs its very movement. See, that we can't exclude value questions. We just need to sort of pivot our point of view on it. So, number 2, defining the digital frontier, taxonomy and evolution. A precise taxonomy is required to avoid the pitfalls of technological determinism, which, underlies the whole issue anyway of determinisms have always been the problem. The fallacious belief that technology dictates social forms independently of class relations. You can see how automatically that's where everything got screwed up or gets screwed up, or people screw it up in order to sell books. This is why some people spend their lifetimes on, the professional managerial class critique. And that's fine, it sells books, but it doesn't quite get at, the kind of fundamental issues that one needs to look at, because the petty bourgeois have been there for centuries. One doesn't need, you just, it's old wine, new bottles in that sense. All right. Anyway, the digital economy is a general purpose technology, GPT, that reconfigures social infrastructure across four distinct yet interlocking layers of valorization. So we're right back in the 19th century again, valorizing and subsumption and all that other stuff is still useful here. The infrastructure layer, and this goes, I won't read all of this, but you can sort of see where this is headed. The physical bedrock of digital capital includes submarine cables, 5G base stations, satellites. Crucially, it encompasses cloud capital, that is, massive data centers, AWS, is Azure, Google Cloud, that serve as the modern factory floor for data processing and storage. Number two, the phantom, or the platform layer. The platform layer, functioning as the advanced commercial capital of our era, these intermediaries, noting, of course, that AWS is also Amazon, right? AWS is Amazon Web Services. These intermediaries, Amazon, Uber, Airbnb, connect fragmented markets and dictate the terms of exchange. Their primary logic is data extraction, serving as a digital sieve through which all market activity must pass. And that's probably the more important element of talking about an attention-driven economy. But anyway, number three, the application and content layer. This is the site of the user interface, the UI, where software as a service, and this is important because this is what plagues everyone now. This is why how people are being exploited in terrible ways, is software as a service, SaaS, and social media, of course, Meta, TikTok, etc., harvest behavioral data. And it's just unfortunate, but that's kind of comes to the territory now. And one needs to not get so upset about it. On the other hand, you do the best you can to opt out and to, put in defensive layers of one thing or another. But ultimately we have to change all this in a really serious way. It is the interface where the consumer is integrated into the circuit of capital. And yes, there's a literature on this. It hasn't advanced as fast as it should have, but that's another story. And that literature actually got sidetracked by an entire other body of literature about human-computer interface. I mean, I think we lost a decade or two because of fiddling around with, HCI yammering. But anyway, number four, the intelligence layer, the algorithmic brain, quote unquote, that is OpenAI, Gemini, consisting of deep learning, which is a whole nother set of issues, and large language models, LLMs. This layer transforms raw data into actionable value, selling intelligence as a service. So that's IaaS to industrial and commercial actors alike. And yes, that's kind of the core of the current problem. Now, the point is, are we at Web 3.0, which is an interesting question, but we're better left elsewhere, probably. The evolution from Web 1.0, the read-only information retrieval era, to Web 2.0, the platform turn of user-generated comment and targeted ads, and finally, to the current algorithmic/AI turn. Note that fields have all of these turns in it. There was a linguistic turn in philosophy. There was a mathematical turn, or a information science turn in geography. There was there was a mathematical experimental turn in neoclassical economics. But anyway, marks the progressive sophistication of capital's constant, that is, constant capital component. In this third stage, the business model shifts towards the renting of computer power and decision-making capabilities. Now, that may seem, sort of either normal or trivial or whatever, but actually this is kind of the linchpin of the problem. And part of it is because, of property issues about people did not adequately protect their own privacy. For privacy alone could have solved, I think, so many of these problems. And privacy rights protection somehow slips past all these libertarians. But anyway, far from replacing the law of value, these layers serve as the modern constant capital through which that law operates, the law of value operates with unprecedented velocity. You're back to econ physics, right? They are the physical embodiment of a system designed for the relentless pursuit of surplus value. Number 3, the law of value from steam engines to artificial intelligence, and this rehearses the whole business of, the thing on which decades was, in my opinion, wasted, but, whatever. Marx's analysis of the Industrial Revolution was an extraction of the logical laws governing the capitalist mode of production, applicable whether the motive power was steam or silicon. At the core of this analysis lies, and this is, what we spent decades on, socially necessary labor time, SNLT, the time required to produce a commodity under normal social conditions with average skill and intensity. Now, in our digital age, the value of a software-driven service, the SaaS or the IaaS, is still fundamentally anchored in abstract human labor. Note that we've been doing this for months, is working through abstraction questions to apply some concept, materialist concept of semiotics, is to provide a better means by which we can talk about abstract human labor, ultimately. The dialectic between productive force and the value form, note that that's the value dash form is a whole thing, right? We've mentioned this before. It's Heinrich and, blah, blah, blah. Creates a relentless competitive imperative. As technology increases productivity, the SNLT per unit decreases, causing the value of individual commodities to fall. This is all normal ways of thinking that, come from Marx. This drives the capture of extra surplus value. The mechanism is precise. An innovative capitalist adopts a superior AI algorithm, allowing them to produce at an individual cost price lower than the social average. And without getting into a whole thing on this is what Marx is concerned about and why he was concerned about, the whole problem of the average, whatever, the so-called, aggregate price issue. By selling at the market price, which is dictated by the social average, what I just said, they capture a surplus profit. Now, this industrial price of production logic compels all competitors to follow suit or face devaluation and exit, ensuring the continuous modernization of the means of production. Furthermore, capital revolutionizes the production process through the application of science, thereby stripping the worker of autonomy. The worker ceases to be the master of the tool and becomes a mere living appendage to capital. That's Marx in the 19th century. Marx identified this as the transition from the formal subsumption of labor to the real subsumption of labor to capital. So nothing's changed. This is pretty much, this is not controversial or whatever. This is just, we're not adding new analysis. This is the same analysis that comes from the 19th century. While the former, that is formal subsumption of labor, involves capital subsuming existing labor processes, that is replacing, substituting machines for humans, etc. The latter, that is characterized by the quote unquote automatic factory. This is what, in Elon's fevered mind is what you wanted to do with Tesla, constitutes the emergence of a specifically capitalist mode of production that begins with, surprise, the 19th century and late 19th century industrial revolution in England. In the contemporary era, however, AI and cloud computing represent the apotheosis of this trajectory. That is, it's kind of transcended this. Intellectual agency is increasingly centralized within the algorithm, a digital architecture that dictates the pace, intensity, and fundamental nature of labor, ensuring the total valorization of every moment. And that's really a key thing to remember. That's what's going on every moment you interact with the large language model. 4, digital transformation is a catalyst for industrial productivity. Industrial capitalist survival depends on digital transformation to reduce operational costs and increase the rate of exploitation. This is an empirical reality. Investments in industrial digital transformation are growing by 15 to 20% annually, leading to a 10 to 30% reduction in operational costs. Hence, people not being rehired or whatever. So there's 6 dimensions. We're getting close to the end. But I wanted to introduce these ideas because I think, they're not, this is not a new set of notions. I think this is, we're just sort of reframing the problem and hopefully getting to a point where we can engage a critique. So, number 1, operational excellence. That is the industrial Internet of Things, the IIoT, and big data. Sensors identify bottlenecks, allowing companies like Siemens to increase output 8-fold. This minimizes wasted labor time and maximizes value extraction. Number 2, predictive maintenance, AI and cloud stuff. Rolls-Royce's Total Care monitors jet engines in real time. Now, this prevents the devaluation of constant capital by ensuring that expensive machinery does not sit idle or break down. Number 3, and this is where it becomes even more important, collaborative robots, cobots. In Tesla or BMW factories, robots handle repetitive tasks, reducing labor costs by 20 to 30%. This increases the productive force, big P, big F, lowering individual cost price. Number 4, algorithmic management. Amazon software calculates exact walking paths. This is tailorization, but anyway, this is the pursuit of, yes, RSV, relative surplus value, intensifying work within the time frame to squeeze value out of every second. Number 5, digital twins. BioNTech company uses simulations to optimize production. This reduces the socially necessary labor time in research and development, minimizing the risk of capital loss before physical production begins. And you can see that the sort of defederalizing or deskilling or privatizing kind of fits in there for a variety of other reasons. Number 6, cloud-based supply chain. Apple manages thousands of suppliers in real time. This reduces circulation time, ensuring surplus value is converted back into money as quickly as possible. Now, the point that the author is making here, in contradistinction to Varoufakis, these technologies do not replace the law of value. They validate it. They are weapons used by individual capitals to compete for surplus profit by driving production costs below the social average. That's what Marx cared about at the front end. Whether through Foxconn's NanoVision AI or Amazon's path calculating software, the objective is identical: the subordination of human labor to an algorithmic regime that minimizes wasted time. This transition from production to the realization of value brings us to the role of the platform. Now, I'm close to the end of my discussion here, but there's some interesting ideas in the article, one being the salto mortale, the death-defying leap in the Marxist framework, the realization of value. That is the transition from commodity, remember, M-C-M M prime, C prime, M prime is a death-defying leap. If a commodity fails to sell, the labor embodied within it is socially wasted, and the capital is lost. Digital platforms function as advanced commercial capital, serving as the ultimate safety net for industrial capital by shortening circulation time and ensuring that the leap, the salto mortale, is successful. Now, this is not a historical mutation, but an evolution. So just as department stores in the 19th century, like Le Bon Marché and the Sears catalog, the analog search engine of its day, utilized scientific management, that is Taylorism, motion time analysis, etc., to rationalize consumption. Modern platforms use data to optimize the turnover of capital. By shortening the time a commodity sits in a warehouse, platforms allow industrial capital to turn over its investment more frequently, thereby increasing the annual mass of profit. Now, a pivotal feature of this stage is the quote unquote, and this is where the parallel to nature is useful, the free gift of data. Marx observed that capital treats natural forces such as waterfalls or fertile land. This is the thing about it, the agriculture comment in the other article, as a free gift of nature. And there's really good literature on this now, and it goes in a bunch of different directions, but really quite useful. In the digital age, consumer data harvested through social interactions, searches, and locations is treated as a quote unquote free gift of human living. Now, this little paragraph here is really essentially about good old 19th century exploitation. This byproduct of human activity fuels algorithms for precision marketing, that is, upselling and cross-selling, ensuring that the C prime dash M prime transition is nearly instantaneous. With global B2B e-commerce reaching $32 trillion and retail e-commerce surpassing a 20% global share, the digitalization of the salto mortale is the primary engine of modern commercial dominance. Now, the subsequent thing, and this is where rent comes back in, differential rent and the Freemasonry of the bourgeoisie. And so, I'm reaching the end of my time, but the point that this article makes, and which is rather quite useful, is to think of it, beyond the cloud analogies, to really move to something more serious. The most profound aspect of this set of arrangements is what Marx called a real Freemasonry, eine wahre Freimaurer. While individual capitalists compete like enemy brothers for their slice of the surplus value cake, they remain a unified class in the collective exploitation of the global working class. See, we've finally gotten back to class struggle. This is not controversial. I mean, this just seems fairly obvious, hopefully. The redistribution of surplus value of the factory owner to the platform titan does not change the source of that value, the unpaid labor of the worker. They are all shareholders in a global enterprise of exploitation, united in the metabolic need to expand capital. So, this is not to say that techno-feudalism is the, substitute, as it were, for capitalism. It's just merely another stage, a different productive stage, and calling it feudalism is interesting, but kind of diverts our cultural attention, with all due respect. So why Varoufakis is wrong. So the techno-feudalism hypothesis argues that the cloud has replaced the market, and hasn't, and rent has replaced profit, signifying the death of capitalism. See, already that's a problematic, This analysis, while rhetorically sharp, it's about selling books, is an analytic failure that misinterprets the most advanced stage of capital for its demise. And so there is a Marxist rebuttal It's not about cloud fiefs as in fiefdoms. Platforms replace markets as site of economic activity. Constant capital, the cloud is a revolutionary evolution of constant capital means of production used to intensify market competition. Cloud rent replaces profit as the primary driver of the system. Differential rent is not a replacement for profit. It is a redistribution of the surplus value already produced in the industrial sector. Cloud serfs, users produce value for free, replacing the wage worker. Exploited labor, value still hinges on productive labor, P, big P. User data is a free gift or byproduct of consumption, not the source of new value. So, to declare the death of capitalism because of the rise of cloud rent is to ignore the P, the productive component, in the circuit of capital. The P here is in the basic, Marxist equation, M dash C dot 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 P dot 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 C prime dash M prime, right? The cloud is not a feudal manor, it is a factory without walls that coordinates global production. The industrial capitalist paying rent to Amazon is not a vassal, but a partner in a more efficient regime of labor subsumption. Techno-feudalism fails to see that the algorithm is the most capitalist tool ever devised. And now to the conclusion, and then I can stop. The enduring power of Marxist analysis. The digital economy, despite its algorithmic complexity and the digital veil of its interfaces, remains governed by, yes, we're back to econo-physics again, laws of motion of capital. The strategy of the modern bourgeoisie has not changed since the 19th century. This is a point I've been making all through this little yammering today. To reduce socially necessary labor time, to accelerate the turnover of capital, and to maximize the extraction of relative surplus value. Now, whether through the real subsumption of the worker to the AI system or the capture of free gifts of data, which is what we're doing all the time, whenever you scan stuff at the supermarket, etc., you're contributing to the system remains a real Freemasonry of exploitation. So the task of the scholar is not to be dazzled by the newness of the digital age, but to expose the age-old logic of capital that resides within the algorithm. To understand the digital economy as an advanced stage of capitalism is a strategic necessity for identifying the true sites of struggle. The task of the Marxist economist remains clear: to strip away the digital, is unfortunately metaphorical, to strip away the digital veil and expose the exploitation that the algorithm was built to hide. The algorithm does hide it. The LLM is hiding all this stuff. The struggle for the value of human life remains, as it always was, the central conflict of our time. So that may seem unsatisfying to you that, we wind up truly, on the one hand, not with techno-feudalism, but simply the same old fight against capitalism, against capital. That may seem unsatisfying, but I think it's still important. Now, why is that important for my little fiddling around? In a quantum framework, the value of land, just as an example, and speaking of the algorithm, the value of land is not a fixed scalar, but wave function. That is probability states rather than fixed certainty. Now, all that yammering there is mathematical stuff, but it does suggest that our analysis is far too linear at the current moment and needs to be, sort of non-linear or anti-linear or whatever. So there's that. I included, of course, not the whole article, but significant portions of it, of F.T. Manning's Geographies of Ground Rent, periodizing ground rent theory, because that's what she's summarizing, spatializing ground rent refusal. And that's the point of her article, which is not really the reason why I was including it, but it is an interesting concept because ground rent refusal is something that does happen in the current North-South third world, settler colonialism, center periphery, whatever, exploitation of lesser developed countries is issues related to ground rent refusal. The idea that some people that can actually resist this, and this creates, opportunities for revolutionary subjectivity or whatever. That's kind of where we are now, and is incredibly problematic for societies that are not moving in a socialist direction. For example, in Latin America. So anyway, so I've included, a certain proportion of that. It's a redefinition of rent. It identifies the taxonomy and typology of rent, which is, I think, very useful. And then I included another article, or I included what is it? Oh, it's a quick summary of differential and absolute ground rent, because you sort of need to understand the nuances of that in order to understand Manning's article, because she uses quite usefully uh, the difference between differential rent one, differential rent two, and absolute rent. Now, the reason why that's important is partially, and also there's a mention here of Anwar Sheikh's in this context, but so after the rent thing, we look more carefully at because this is related to the work of Deepankar Basu, who's part of the, if you will, the Amherst School. He's the next generation, as it were, of theoretical folks doing this work. So there's this article, which is not his rent article. The rent article is interesting too, because Basu tries to ignore absolute rent when in fact you sort of need it. But that's actually useful and important, because speaking of agriculture, Basu, sets, aside absolute rent because, it doesn't really apply for a lot of modern agriculture. On the other hand, you could argue that there's a way to deal with it that way. But anyway, that's for another time. So this article is more of an article on macroeconomic elements, and is a symptomatic, as it were, of the new interpretation of Duncan Foley, et cetera, on circuit of capital models. So this gets us all the way back to what we started at the beginning, is that, it's still about Department 1 and Department 2. It's still about circuits of capital and the laws of motion, or the, description of motion, the flow stock issues of modern capitalism. So anyway, I think I've yammered far too much, and I've exceeded my time. But this is just the first section of the article, and it is useful because it gives us ways in which we can talk about capital that fit with our prior discussions that also include rent. And yes, calling rent capital is controversial for some people. So that's a whole nother set of issues, but one that needs to be worked through. I mean, clearly needs to be worked through, because why? The great financial crisis was essentially built on I would assert, a kind of misunderstanding or mislabeling or manipulation of precisely this set of differences. And measuring that is useful as if nothing else, as a thought experiment to engage a criticism of late capitalism. So anyway, so I'm going to stop. Let me see if there's any trenchant questions. Easier to imagine the end of the world. Human existence thank you, Robert. Human existence becoming totalized as never before, indeed. I agree. Uh, Consumption is also production. Deleuze and Guattari, yes, absolutely. That's where I was headed with that. Deleuze and Guattari are really important for that idea, because it sort of inverts or transforms certain things against which or beyond which the reason why people still read like Zizek, Lacan, is for exactly that kind of reason, because you sort of need Deleuze and Guattari to sort of get one through this sort of advanced Star Trek view of what the economy is. All right, so I'm gonna get away from I'm gonna close the live stream and